Hello, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on women and Alzheimer's disease with Dr. Liisa Galea. My name is Meg Smith, and I am the CEO of Cure Alzheimer's Fund. Today, we will get to hear a fascinating talk from Dr. Galea, and then she and I will have a conversation about her work. But before I introduce her, please allow me to take a minute to introduce Cure Alzheimer's Fund. CureAlz has one mission: to fund research that will accelerate prevention, treatment, and a cure for this disease. To that end, in our 20-year history, we have supported more than $175 million in extraordinary research pursued by brilliant and dedicated scientists around the world. All of this is possible thanks to our dedicated donors who share our drive and determination to end this disease and its terrible impact on patients, families, and communities. We are grateful for their trust in us and determined to honor it by finding and funding the most important research to ending the burden of this disease. We are held accountable for serving our mission by our board of directors. They, with certain other dedicated supporters, cover all of our operational overhead. This generosity and vision means our wonderful donors know that their gift goes 100% to support our research program. The science we fund is selected by our research leadership group, comprised of experts across scientific specialties relevant to Alzheimer's. All of our scientific decision-making is done by active researchers who themselves are at the forefront of Alzheimer's discovery. When we first recruited Dr. Liisa Galea to CureAlz, our research leadership group was impressed by her discoveries regarding sex differences in neurogenesis tied to genetic risk of Alzheimer's disease. We will hear more about that work and other great findings from her lab today. Dr. Liisa Galea is the inaugural Women Mind Trey Living Family Chair in Women's Mental Health and leads the Women's Health Research Cluster at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and is a professor at the University of Toronto in Ontario. She is the principal editor of Frontiers in Neuroendocrinology, the president of the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences, and co-vice president of the Canadian Organization for Sex and Gender Research. She is the perfect guest to talk about this topic with us today, a tireless advocate for women's health research and for sex and gender-based analysis to improve cognitive aging for all, and we are lucky to get to hear from her today. So without further ado, I will turn the Zoom over to Dr. Liisa Galea.
Well, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm going to begin, unless I hear otherwise. Okay, thank you so much for giving me this invitation to talk about one of my very favorite topics. For the last 25 years, I have been laser focused on why women are more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and depression. What is it about our brains that makes us more susceptible to these different disorders? And are there some female-specific experiences like pregnancy and menopause that might be driving this increased risk for these disorders? And as a neuroscientist, one of the big things that we notice is that there are a number of sex differences in prevalence of brain disorders. And I've put some common ones out there in this brain cloud. The ones that are in blue are male biased, the ones that are pink are female biased. And maybe what you can see is that the ones in blue are more shown earlier in life, whereas the ones that are in pink are more on average shown a little bit later in life, including Alzheimer's disease. Now, these may or may not be due to the fact that we see sex differences or influences in the brain. We see them in terms of gray matter volume, and all that means is the number of cells that are in a particular area. And hopefully you can see right away that there are just as many areas that show more cells in females, that's in the red, and as there are more cells in males, which are shown in the blue. So it's not like one sex has more cells all over the brain. It's a hodgepodge. There are also sex differences in white matter, and this is sort of like the highways, the fiber tracks that connect the cell bodies. And even though this is a little more controversial, there are ideas that males have more of these fiber tracks within each hemisphere, and females have them across each hemisphere. So these may or may not contribute to the fact that we see these sex differences in prevalence of all these different brain diseases. But what interests me even more than this is that we also see sex differences in the manifestation of a number of different brain disorders. And that's true both in terms of how it affects the brain, but also how it affects memory. And including Alzheimer's disease, females tend to show more severe cognitive impairment with Alzheimer's disease. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Now, I'm going to be using sex and gender somewhat interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable. So sex refers to the biological characteristics that are different between males, females, and intersex individuals. Gender is more of a psychosocial construct. It's how we identify as a man, a woman, a gender diverse and non-binary individual. And I'm using these terms slightly binary. And I will talk about male and female and men and women differences, but I want to make it really clear that neither of these terms are binary, and that all of the disparities that I'm talking about between males and females and men and women are many-fold greater in people of color, Indigenous, trans, and gender diverse individuals. And each of these communities deserves to be studied and acknowledged because their experiences and their health outcomes and disease risks will be different than that between males and females and men and women. Now I'm showing you pictures across my family, and I think it's pretty obvious that there are a number of sex and perhaps gender differences that you see across a lifespan. And you're probably all very well familiar with the fact that females tend to live longer than males. But you might not be familiar with the fact that they're also more likely to live with chronic illness. And this is my mother, who suffered from a severe form of Parkinson's disease, as well as endometrial cancer and arthritis towards the end of her life. Now, this study came out a few years ago showing that on average, for over 1,300 different diseases, females were diagnosed 2 years later than males were for the very same disease, including Alzheimer's disease. Now, there are probably many reasons for this, both on the sort of the biological side and on the societal side. For example, females often have their symptoms dismissed in emergency rooms or in doctor offices. But I actually think that one of the big reasons for this delay in diagnosis is that most of the medical knowledge that's out there has been based on males and the male standard. It was thought that really females don't differ very much. In fact, all of our diagnosis criteria, most of them, are based on that male standard. And there's a problem when we always think about males and we don't think about females. If you look at a variety of brain disorders, symptoms in females are called atypical. And this is true in disorders that show more of a male bias, like autism and ADHD, disorders that have more of a female bias, like depression and PTSD, but also in terms of disorders where you don't see a sex difference in prevalence, which just means who gets the disorder, like bipolar disorder. And so what that suggests to me is that there's a systemic bias. And I think we have to be really careful about this. If we're always diagnosing based on what happens in men and males, we can't assume that what happens in females is atypical. It's certainly not atypical for that 50% of the population. Right? So what else are we missing when we're always thinking about the male standard? And to me, it's sort of akin to comparing apples and oranges. We can't always assume that a male can stand in as a default for females because there's just too many differences in brain, in prevalence of different disorders. And to me, it's sort of like we might have the wrong manual, right? It might be like we're trying to fix a refrigerator with an oven manual. Some things will be very similar. They'll have a cord that you plug in, but some things are going to be completely different. Like a refrigerator keeps things cold and an oven keeps things warm. And in fact, in neuroscience, we often see these different opposite signatures of a disease within the brain itself between males and females. And it's something that really should be capitalized more on because we can learn more about a disease if we think about how it might be represented differently in different people. Now, what about Alzheimer's disease? We know that there are modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors for late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease. I put some common modifiable risk factors and the top 3 non-modifiable risk factors up there. And it turns out that sex plays a role in each of these risk factors. And today I'll just be talking about the ones that are highlighted in purple there. But we know, for example, that advanced age, as we advance in age, we also have a greater chance to develop Alzheimer's disease. And that's depicted in this graph. You can see these are different age groups. The prevalence, which is just the number of people with Alzheimer's disease per 1,000 people, increases as we age. But you can also see in this graph, females are depicted in the orange, males in the green, that females at every single age point have higher levels of diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So irrespective of the fact that they're more likely to live longer, you still see these sex differences even at the younger ages. The other thing is that for other dementias like vascular dementia, you don't see the same kind of sex difference. So that suggests there's something special about Alzheimer's disease. Why are women more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease? And in fact, there's twice the lifetime risk for women compared to men. It's not just how many of us are getting the disease, it's also that we show more neuropathology related to the disease. So the two common neuropathologic features, amyloid beta plaques, neurofibrillary tangles that are located within brain cells or outside of cells, females themselves show more of this pathology and show more cognitive impairment or memory impairment with this neuropathology. So that should mean something. Now let's think about this ApoE4 genotype. About 40 to 50% of individuals with Alzheimer's disease actually have this genotype. But there's a difference between males and females. Females are at a much greater risk. So you can have 1 or 2 copies of this, or 0, of this particular allele. And if you're a male, you're at twice the risk with 1 copy, 4 times the risk if you have 2 copies. If you're a female with 1 copy, you can see it's much a fold greater. You're 8 times the risk versus 12 times the risk if you have 2 copies of this allele. So what can this tell us? Why not use this information to tell us more about the disease? Why not use this to tell us more about who is more at risk and who is more resilient to the disease? And so work from my lab and others has been starting to look at how this ApoE4 genotype and sex work together to maybe drive the disease forward. And this is from a human database where we looked at neurofibrillary tangles, and this is in cerebral spinal fluid. And these are individuals without any ApoE4 genotype, that's 0, and this is with 1 or 2 copies of this ApoE4 genotype. And the lighter blue are the females and the darker blue are the males. And hopefully you can see right away, those with 1 or 2 copies, if you're female, you also have disproportionately higher levels of this phosphorylated tau. Now, this is not just in individuals that have Alzheimer's disease. These are in people that are cognitively normal. And what that suggests to me, and this is just a theory, that these females have a greater disposition to have one of these neuropathological features. So maybe this is occurring earlier in females with this genotype than it is in males. And again, why not use that information to understand what might be driving the disease in females compared to males? I think it's also important to think about other high-risk groups to develop Alzheimer's disease. And another group is the amnestic mild cognitive impairment. About 50% of these individuals would transition to Alzheimer's disease. And you can imagine this is pretty interesting to try and figure out who's at risk, who's resilient to this transfer into Alzheimer's disease. Now, if we think about sex and who's getting the disease, it's actually males that are more likely to be diagnosed with amnestic mild cognitive impairment. And I've already told you, females are more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So wait a minute, this doesn't really make sense, or does it make sense? Maybe. Why are females more likely to be diagnosed? Are they transitioning more? I think this is an open question, and there's a lot we can learn by studying the sexes. And I'd like to show you lots of data on this. There's not that much out there. So there are a few studies that are out there that do suggest that there are some differences between males and females with amnestic mild cognitive impairment. Females themselves show greater, faster cognitive decline with amnestic MCI and lower levels of brain activity, smaller cortical thickness. And males with amnestic MCI, we did this study. It's a very small sample size, so take it with a grain of salt. But we found that males with amnestic MCI have higher levels of stress hormones and more memory disturbances with stress. So what these data suggest is there may be different processes between males and females once they are diagnosed with amnestic mild cognitive impairment that might drive forward risk and resilience for the disease. And why not use this, harness this power of these sex differences to understand who is at greater risk to develop the disorder? Because then we can use that to figure out how we can stop Alzheimer's disease in its tracks. Let's think a little bit more about how we diagnose Alzheimer's disease and amnestic mild cognitive impairment. Generally, we're using performance on memory tests. And there are many different types of memory tests that are out there. And it turns out, and this is just in normal aging, it turns out that females score higher than males do on these tests. So you see females here in the orange and males in the gray, and you can see they have higher scores for a variety of these tests. Now imagine if you don't consider that, you might not be capturing all the people that you need to capture or seeing that they have lower levels of memory, right? If females are always scoring higher, you might need to consider that in terms of your diagnosis. And in fact, most of the time this isn't considered, but a researcher named Erin Sunderman did this work. So she looked at sex-specific norms to diagnose amnestic mild cognitive impairment. And she found she could improve diagnostic accuracy by 20%. That's actually quite a bit. So she found 10% more females at risk and 10% fewer males at risk, or that could be diagnosed with amnestic MCI. So what does that tell us? It tells us a lot. It tells us that on a personal level, you don't want to be misdiagnosed. You want to have an accurate diagnosis. So you can think about this on a personal level, but you can also think about this in terms of a research level. If we're trying to find that biomarker or that factor that might stop Alzheimer's in its track, that will stop that 50% transition from amnestic MCI to Alzheimer's disease, if we have noisy data, if we don't have that clear diagnosis at the beginning, that's going to interfere with us trying to find out what that biomarker might be. Now, as a neuroscientist, of course, I'm fixated on certain regions, and one of the regions that I think is really fascinating is this area in the brain called the hippocampus. It's really important for memory and emotion. It shows cell loss with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, it's one of the very first areas that shows cell loss. And it's also very plastic in adulthood. And that plasticity, you can look at it in many different ways, but it's really intriguing to look at. One of the ways that we look at neuroplasticity in my lab is looking at something called neurogenesis, which is the birth of new brain cells. And you might have heard that, you're born with all the brain cells you have, and then they prune off and you don't, have any capacity to build new brain cells throughout life. But that's not actually true. There is one area of the hippocampus that shows this continual production of new neurons. It's true in all mammalian species studied to date. Now, of course, we've been looking at whether or not there are sex differences. Do we see sex differences? And actually, in terms of the number of these new mature brain cells, we don't see a big sex difference. We see a big aging effect, right? Middle age, you see many fewer of these cells, but no differences between the sexes. But being the group that we are, we wanted to look at this a little more closely. And it turns out that there are there's a process that's involved in forming these mature new brain cells. And I think of this sort of as a tortoise and the hare, because even though they're both ending up in the same place, so it's not the same ending as a tortoise and the hare, but males have more neural stem cells. These neural stem cells form two daughter cells when they decide to divide, and males have more of these daughter cells in the hippocampus. But then at least one of these cells will become a mature new neuron in the hippocampus. Excuse me. And as I already told you, males and females have the same density of these new cells at the end of the day. But because males have more of the potential, more stem cells, more daughter cells, something happens to the process that ends them up in the same place, suggesting that the maturation patterns and attrition patterns of the production of these new cells is quite different. That also means if you want to use this as a treatment, you might need to target different parts of the pathway between males and females to sort of plug that gap. And in terms of bringing it back to the ApoE4 genotype, that higher risk for Alzheimer's disease genotype, we can look at this in animal models by using animals, mice or rats, that have this gene inserted into their genome. And so we've done just that. We've looked at wild type versus those with this high risk genotype. And this is in males. This is looking at the stem cells. And we see that there's a reduction in stem cells. We also see there's a reduction in these new immature new brain neurons. And so that suggests that maybe part of the risk for Alzheimer's disease in males with this ApoE4 genotype is due to this reduced neuroplasticity in this region. But what about females? They're the ones that are at greater risk. And what we found is that there's no difference in the neurostem cells. And actually, there's higher numbers of these immature new brain cells that we see in this brain, in female brains with this ApoE4 high-risk genotype. Now, what that might suggest is a number of things, and I don't have time to get into all of what it might suggest, but it might suggest that that in males, the pathway that's first stimulated is neuroplasticity in terms of the ApoE high risk genotype. But in females, it might not be the neuroplastic pathway, at least in the hippocampus, that's first interrupted. It might be something like that tau neuropathology mechanism I showed you earlier. So hopefully what I've demonstrated so far is that sex differences in Alzheimer's disease go beyond greater longevity, and that I really think it's important to study these high-risk transition to Alzheimer's individuals using that power of sex differences. Because what we might be able to discover is that males and females show different pathways to Alzheimer's disease. And this would be really important and has a lot of implications for early intervention, stopping Alzheimer's disease in its tracks, and also treatments. But the problem is that there are very few studies that are actually looking at whether sex influences outcomes. So we did this study a few years ago now, or last year, and we found that a lot of papers in neuroscience are looking at both sexes, but very few, only 5% are actually looking to see whether there's a difference between males and females in their outcomes. This is a problem because, as I told you, we do see some differences in outcomes, and it can inform on the disease. I'm going to give you another real-life example, which is lecanemab. You might have heard of this because it made the news as it was one of a drug that seems to slow cognitive decline with Alzheimer's disease. It clears that amyloid beta, not tau, but that amyloid beta. And it does show some slowing of cognitive decline. But what the headlines, it also has some major side effects, particularly for people with that ApoE4 genotype. But what those headlines don't show you is that it actually has a stronger effect, beneficial effect in males, less of a strong effect in females. So if these lines cross these dotted line, that suggests it's not as strong of an effect. And in fact, we also see, or the individuals also saw that this was not very favorable. Lecanemab doesn't work as well in people with these two copies of the ApoE4 genotype, so those at greatest risk. And I think that's okay. It's a sign that this is precision. You might have heard the term precision medicine or personalized medicine. I think this is a good example of how this might work better in males of a certain genotype and not so well in females of another genotype. But the other thing I want to briefly talk about is that female-specific factors can influence aging and Alzheimer's risk. We know there are a number of female-specific factors that influence health outcomes and disease risk. There aren't that many studies out there, but those of the studies that are out there suggest that the type of menopause, when you undergo menopause, can influence aging. And hormone therapy, depending on the dose, the route of administration, the type of hormone therapy can also influence aging and Alzheimer's risk. But what about pregnancy history? I'm going to give you one little slide about pregnancy history because that's something that's near and dear to my heart and that I've been studying. There are a number of physiological changes that occur during pregnancy and the postpartum, and you've probably heard of things like postpartum depression. So there's an increase in psychiatric disorders that occurs in the short term after pregnancy. And then work out of Switzerland with Anne-Marie Delange and some work we've done in animal models shows that in middle age, you actually see a decrease in brain aging. And then there's some controversial data suggesting that there might be an increase in Alzheimer's disease risk, particularly with grandparity, which just means 3 or more children. And I'd like to tell you much more about this. Perhaps I'll come back at another time to tell you about it. But there are very few studies that actually look at how pregnancy alters brain health, under 1% of studies. And when we come back to the idea of the modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors for late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease, I've told you that sex plays a role, I've shown you some evidence for it. But what about women's health factors? How do they play a role in these risk factors? It's hard to answer all of those questions because the publishing bias in neuroscience is real. There are 9 times more male-only studies than female-only studies. And when we actually look at those female-specific factors, it's under 2% of studies in neuroscience that look at these factors and how they might play a role. People are starting to notice that women's health research and studies are underfunded, undervalued, and underfunded. I think I said all of them already. And there's been some nice editorials in Nature. I've written quite a few of them, and you can learn more about them from some of those groups, and I'm happy to talk more about them if you'd like. And hopefully I've given you some idea that understanding the basic neurobiology and disease mechanisms in males, females, and intersex individuals will lead us to better individualized treatment. To me, that's the heart of precision medicine. And I don't want us to forget about those female-specific factors and intersectionality, and that would be things like race, ethnicity, and how those also might play a role in our risk for Alzheimer's disease. And obviously, I want to thank Cure for Alzheimer's Fund for supporting my research. So thank you very much.
Liisa, that was great. Thank you so much. You gave us a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. But before we get back into all the depths of your work and all the implications, which I think are concerning for all of us, can I ask you how you got into this? I mean, neuroscience is hard, right? And as you point out, neuroscience that thinks specifically about women's health is underfunded, understudied, and undervalued. So how and why did you pick the very tallest mountain to climb?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a struggle, I have to tell you. You know, I've always been really interested. I'm a woman of a certain age. So my parents were amazing because they told me, look, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't, don't let anybody stop you. Don't let them tell you that you can't do it because you're a girl. And I really took that to heart. And I was cleaning out my parents' house the other day, and I found like a list of things I wanted to do when I was 12 or something. And one of them was understand brains versus girl brains. And so I guess I just always had this inherent, like, why are people telling me I can't do something when I think I can? And to be honest, it's been kind of great because in science, you always want to be more novel. You want to show that you're different. And so in some ways, it's been nice because I could ask one novel question, which was almost always what happens in females. So a lot of my work is in females or showing that there are differences between the two. But I realized as I went further along that, like, it can't, we need more work in this area because I mean, I'm sure many of the viewers will have experienced this themselves or love someone who's experienced this, going to the doctor's office or going to the emergency room and not being able to, quickly and accurately diagnose a problem. And I do really think that that's because most of our medical knowledge has been based on the fact that they're, males, and we don't really need to worry about females because they're just small males, which is unfortunately not quite the case.
Well, so cure-alls has been requiring the use of both sexes of animals for a long time. And when we started doing that, it was amazing how revolutionary that apparently was for a lot of the people who reached out to us for funding. And we've gotten a lot of pushback over the years, although we've stood our ground about this. Because, for example, the animal models used primarily in neuroscience are mice, and mice don't undergo menopause the way humans do.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how we can think differently about, the differences between being human and the rest of the mammals out there, and how to study women differently than just female animals?
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's a loaded question. There's a lot in there and I'm writing down the word giraffe, which I'll tell you why later. But yeah, you had a lot in there, but I will say there's a couple things. One of the worst cases I saw when we did that study where we looked at, I don't think I said this, but when we looked at that study where how many studies were actually looking at whether sex played a role in the data analysis, that was over 3,000 studies. That was done mainly by 2 undergraduate students who were supposed to work in my lab in 2020.
Oh,
And they were upset, right? Because they couldn't go to the lab, everything was shut down. I said, okay, let's start looking at the literature, and because it's something we can do remotely. And one of the worst examples I saw in 2019 in a very, very good journal, and it was an Alzheimer's study in mice, was that in the sort of control group, they used, I'm going to just make up numbers, but they used like 10 males and 2 females. And then in the Alzheimer's model, it was a reverse. They used 2 males and 10 females. So even though they're using both sexes, they're not using them effectively, right? That's not going to tell us very much. So there's quite a bit of that going on. So I'm really glad that Cure-Alls has stood their ground, because it's so important. And it's really important it's not just about prevalence. It's about, are the mechanisms different? They might look like they're the same place, like with the neurogenesis findings, the number of those new cells is not different, but the pathways they use to get to there are quite different. Tortoise and hare sort of analogy. So I think that's really important. Absolutely. I think with any disease that people are interested in, it's really important to know who gets it and when, and what your model is like. I do really believe that we can benefit for thinking about sex and gender and female specific experiences, even in our clinical studies. So often they're run without any attention to sex. Usually people will use it as a statistical way of removing sex. So it's called a covariate. There was a great study that was done a couple of years ago by Neil Epperson's group, where she showed that if people, of the 20% of studies that actually looked at sex in the neuroimaging studies, 72% of them found an effect. So once people look, they generally, you're going to find a difference. Obviously, any model is going to have its issues. Even though mice don't go through menopause, they do go through something called an estropause. So it is different. They don't, it's not like mice keep reproducing. So they slow down quite a bit as they age. And there's a number of features that are very similar. So some of the hormones can be quite similar. So it's a matter of thinking about what's happening in mice, thinking about what's happening in your animal system, thinking what's happening in the human clinical world as well, and trying to make inferences from that. And the reason I wrote down giraffe is because there is a cardiologist somewhere in the US. I can't remember her name. I'm very sorry. But I read a really nice article where she talked about, she was on safari, or she was in a zoo or something, and she was watching a giraffe. She must have been on safari. She was watching a very pregnant giraffe running. And she thought, like, it's not doing any worse than on any of the non-pregnant giraffes. And I don't know if you know this, but during pregnancy, everything changes, right? Your whole physiology changes. Your cardiac heart function actually increases by about 50%, and your lung capacity is reduced by about 50%. And so it's actually thought of as one of the first stress tests during pregnancy for a woman or a female. And so she thought, what can we learn from giraffes that can tell us about cardiac physiology and women? And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Same thing, there's this idea that elephants don't get cancer very often. They do get it, but very, very, very low level. So what can we learn about elephants? What's different about the elephant physiology, and how might that help humans? And the other thing I just want to say is, sometimes people say, well, have said to me, well, women's health is niche. First of all, how is it niche when it's 50% of the body? I don't understand that at all. But also, if we pay attention to sex and gender, it is going to help all sexes and all genders. I personally believe. I think that's a real big part of precision medicine. And another example, it's not Alzheimer's, it's multiple sclerosis. But people with multiple sclerosis, when they're pregnant, a lot of their symptoms go into remission. So what is it about pregnancy that might be driving that? And will that same signal work in males? It might. We don't know. Right? So that's why I think it could be very helpful.
So it's interesting that you raise multiple sclerosis, because of course women are at higher risk of a whole bunch of different autoimmune disorders. And of course, the genetics and late onset classic Alzheimer's disease really point to the immune response as being a central driver to neurodegeneration and tissue loss and eventual cognitive dysfunction.
Right.
So should we be thinking of this as an autoimmune disorder? Can we think of it that way for women differently than men?
I think that there is real value in that, and that's something that with the Cure All's money, we're looking at some of that, and I have some preliminary data that looks amazing, I would say. Um, I, I mean, there is definitely a school of thought that suggests that it is a fruitful avenue to look at, and then I would also ask the audience to think about, and I know I'm fixated on pregnancy, but on pregnancy because you've got a foreign body inside of you when you're pregnant. And the immune system is really dysregulated during this time period, right? Because you don't want to reject that fetus. Sometimes I call it a parasite, depending on how I feel about my children at the time. And so it's possible that some of these links with pregnancy history and brain health later on in life might be due to this sort of immunological challenge. But what an amazing thing if we can find some immune markers that might be pushing people towards more risk for Alzheimer's disease. Because if we can find them and treat that early, that's a pretty amazing, thing to discover.
Well, absolutely. And to your point about you don't know until you look, we've had a number of our labs reporting that microglial cells, which are, of course, agents of the innate immune system in the brain, behave very differently in cell culture depending on whether they are derived from human female donors or human male donors. And that suggests that this estrogen transition during menopause can't be the whole answer.
No.
So, when you hear, oh, well, menopause is the risk factor that makes women different from men, how do you think about that in the bigger picture? I mean, how much of a role do you think menopause is truly playing?
I mean, I do think that it's playing a role. We do know that if you undergo menopause quickly, like a surgical menopause, that results in, cognitive deficits, memory impairment fairly quickly. We do know that if you give an appropriate dosage of hormone treatments, that will offset that. People think about estrogens all the time, but there are many other hormones that come from the ovary that might also be contributing. No, it cannot answer everything, because if it answered everything, then the average age of menopause is about 51.8 years of age. So that would mean that Alzheimer's disease would start then, or what, like a year later, and we know that that's just not true, right? We see this gradual increase as we age, so it's just part of the equation, and it might send some people further down a slope, perhaps, than other people. But yes, the activity of microglia, that's something also we're doing with Cure All's money. We've been looking at a gene expression that's very different between males and females, and we haven't analyzed all the data yet. When we're sort of playing around with microglia and looking at learning and memory, it looks like it's the females with a certain genotype that seem to be affected more by that than the males. And I think that's really, really interesting. So that points to exactly what you're saying, that, it might be these microglia are the sort of main immune cells in the brain. And they might be playing a very different role in females than they are in males. And again, I think it's really fascinating. I can't tell you though how frustrating it can be. I mean, you started with this question because as a researcher, when I'm like looking in the literature to see, oh, okay, we see this thing with microglia, or I was looking for amnestic MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and how many other studies have looked at sex as a factor. It's just so few. Most of the time, people use both sexes but don't not analyze. So you're no further ahead because I can't tell if there's something there, and I'm not really sure what the reluctance is to look, but when people do look, you do see these different signatures, and I think that's really interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think, hold the key to our, I mean, of course I've drunk the Kool-Aid, so I think it holds the key to our success.
Well, if we can figure out what makes one sex more vulnerable or have an advantage, and we can replicate or defend against it in the other, it helps everybody. I mean, I think that's really part of the power and value of the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
So let me get back to this thing that you mentioned about sex and gender, because
Yes.
again, these two things are quite different, of course, but at the same time, they're very connected too.
Yes.
Um, so, one of the other ways that menopause is implicated, particularly with emerging evidence that we're supporting, and others are as well, of course, at WashU and elsewhere, is sleep disruptions and the importance of sleep to
Yeah.
clearance of misfolded proteins in Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Are you able to think about how do you, as a scientist, disconnect gender and sex? So, women may get less sleep while they are in the throes of breastfeeding and raising toddlers. They might again get less sleep during menopause, which is both a sex and a gender question, perhaps. How do you tease these things apart?
Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question. And every time I think I can, somebody will point out something that I'll like, right. You know, to me, it comes back to, and I don't know that I did the sex and gender definition as a service, because I talked about the biological features and males and females and intersex and gender being gender identity, but it's more than that. It's how society has expectations of you at all different levels within society. And so, I sometimes I show a picture of my husband who identifies as a man vacuuming, and I say this is what is expected of him in terms of his household. But it's things like going to the mall, going to get your, the car mechanic, and how you might be treated differently based on how you present yourself. And to me, that kind of, if I break it down as a scientist, I break that down into genes and environment. There's always this question of nature and nurture, what matters more. And honestly, it's always a bit of both, right? It's always that interaction by, just because you have the ApoE4 genotype doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. It just means you have a greater risk. So what can you do to stop that risk or to reduce it as much as possible? And so I think of sex as sort of being the genes part, because it's chromosomes XX, XY, XXY, X naught, and the gender as being that environmental part. And it could be how much stress you have in your life. It could be your social economic status. It's all wrapped up into that sort of part. I will say the sleep, I'm not a sleep researcher, but it's super interesting because certainly during perimenopause, hot flashes, night sweats, that all interferes with sleep. And so there's some really good evidence from Pauline Mackey's work that if you're taking hormone treatments, you have less sleep disturbances, less interruptions in the brain. And that's kind of important. That's what I brought to my gynecologist when I said, I want some hormone therapy. I brought those studies to them. And I lost my train of thought. We can edit this part out. What else? Oh, yeah. But what's also interesting is that when you bring people into a sleep lab, and again, I'm not a sleep researcher, so you'd have to ask somebody that's an expert in this, you'll see that women have more subjective complaints of sleep, but actually they're getting better sleep than they thought they did. And so how that might wrap up into the biology is really, really interesting. And I do think we always have to think about how sex and gender play a role in any of the results that we're thinking about, in terms of access to people, in terms of being heard, I think is another important one. But it's virtually impossible to sort of disentangle. You could think about the trans community, because they're becoming a larger population. And I think we have a lot to learn from the trans community, because for trans women, they don't undergo menopause. They're taking their hormones throughout life. And that's fantastic, because can we learn from that? Can we figure out what's a good dose in trans individuals, and then bring that back to cisgendered individuals, right? We can learn from each other. And that's, again, why it's so important to consider sex and gender in our work.
Absolutely. The sleep question is interesting because how do we define good sleep? If it's how you feel, then whatever you report is true. How do we get to say that if you don't feel refreshed, you actually did get good sleep?
That's true. I know that does sound kind of dismissive, doesn't it?
A little bit.
We
can edit that out too.
Yeah, no, that's totally a gendered thing. But I was just reading a chapter the other day that was just talking about the subjective complaints versus objective laboratory experiments, and what and the disconnect between the two. But absolutely, it's about how your perception of it is so important in
Hmm.
terms of how you feel. I wear a Fitbit, so it tells me, it gives me a sleep score. I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with that. And sometimes I get a good sleep score, and I think, no, I did not. I had crappy sleep last night. How can that possibly be true? So I take your point. I think that's a really fascinating way to think about it. And in terms of like, babies and postpartum, I mean, you are talking about a situation that is much earlier on in life, but that's true. Maybe with grandparity, maybe with three or more, because of that sleep disruption, that could be accumulating more. It's all these stressors in life that might be accumulating more to give you a greater risk. That absolutely could be playing a role. I was going to give you a little joke, which is that my husband would say things like, "Oh, Jared slept through the night." That's the name of my firstborn. And I'd say, "No, honey, you slept through the night."
Exactly. I had that too. Well, and with women having children later often in life, and if you're talking about people who are having children in their early 40s, and we know that amyloid begins to accumulate decades before you're going to get an Alzheimer's diagnosis, you could actually be talking about an overlap between the period in which amyloid begins to accumulate and you're actually having disrupted sleep from those early years of child rearing.
Oh yeah, that's really important to think about. And I mean, I wrote down 0.43% because it's so hard because some people have started to look at the age of first pregnancy and whether
Mhm.
that matters in terms of Alzheimer's risks. And it does look like actually it's the opposite. If you have earlier, you're more likely you have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. It's not a really, really high risk of, I don't want viewers to get really, really, and it's very few studies, so it's really hard to gain any knowledge from that. But there's also we have a preprint out looking at rats with that ApoE4 and whether or not they had pregnancy. And we do see some differences. So we actually see that in the wild type, like so the no ApoE4 genotype, you get a pregnancy, you see more neurogenesis in middle age, so like less brain aging, because we know that with middle age you see this reduction. But if it's in the ApoE4 rats and they've had a pregnancy, you actually see a reduction of pregnancy. So I sort of borrow Roberta Brinton's healthy cell bias. Pregnancy might be beneficial if you don't have a risk for Alzheimer's disease, or you don't have amyloid beta perhaps accumulating, but it could be beneficial if you don't have it accumulating. It could be detrimental if you do have it accumulating. So that absolutely can play a role, but again, we don't have all of the answers because there's just so few people doing that work.
Is APOE4 associated with greater reproductive success?
It's less.
Less. Interesting.
Yeah, less success. So that doesn't work. That particular analogy there didn't work because it goes the opposite way. But sometimes somebody taught me many years ago when I first started, because I got a finding I didn't think I was going to find, and they said, "Why are you upset about that? It doesn't work the way you thought it did, and that's still information, and that's still important." And the fact that there is a relationship there does suggest that something is going on, right? It does suggest that there's some kind of tie there that would be important to follow up on.
Well, so to get back to the gender versus sex question, what your work is demonstrating is that there are very clear biological differences that will drive differences in Alzheimer's risk and therefore in incidence and prevalence. So, the argument that used to be made that, well, women just live longer, or they are getting less education, they're less out in the workforce, their gendered experience is why they are actually at higher risk. Your work really blows that right out of the water, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think so, but of course I'm a little biased in terms of that. And I was just at the Alzheimer's conference in Amsterdam, and I had to do a debate exactly on this. So I had the look, it's biology, and someone else had a no, it's the social aspects of longevity. And it was kind of a fun debate to have. But most of that data, I mean, it's not that longevity doesn't contribute, and it's not that education doesn't contribute. It's just not the whole answer for why women are at greater risk. You can't even say that when you see, I think you can't say that when you see that data showing that it's so much greater risk to develop Alzheimer's disease with the ApoE4 genotype in women, right? It goes from 2 to 8, I think, if you have one, particularly with one copy. So to me, that has to stem from a biological reason. And you can use people will use things like education as a factor to see how much of it accounts for in terms of that data. But I'm not saying that it doesn't matter at all. It's just not the whole reason. And the other thing that I've seen a lot over my 25 years is this sort of talking away that sex matters for our brain health. You see it also in depression. Oh, it's not that women are more likely to be diagnosed with depression. It's because they're more willing to talk about their feelings. But when you go, there's been lots of studies now looking like sample sizes that are huge, going into communities, knocking on door to door, and asking people sort of the checklist of depression symptoms, and you still see that bias. Right? You still see that it's twice more females than males that are diagnosed with depression. And then there's actually a tie between depression and Alzheimer's disease, which you're probably very well aware of as well. So I think it's important to think about all of the different reasons for why there might be a sex or gender difference in the data. But I think it's also important not to talk it away, to actually keep investigating the possible causes of these differences. And you can't tell people that, oh, pregnancy increases the risk, so stop at getting pregnant. People are, that's just, nobody's going to do that. What I think that work can be important for is, hey, you might have a greater risk because of this, so maybe exercise more, or maybe try to, certainly your social supports would be pretty good, but try to find good social activities, try to do some more exercise, that kind of stuff, in terms of mitigating your risk. I had more to say, but I don't remember what it was.
Liisa, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I know our community is really appreciative, as I am, of getting to hear all about your work and your perspective on and how we all need to be more focused on investing in women's health and women's cognitive futures. So thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for your time today. And I cannot wait to see your new data.